The morning sun had barely cleared the ridge when Caleb Hartley rode into the dusty village of Santo Creek. It was a small settlement, little more than a trading post and a few scattered homes, but it was the closest place to resupply before the long ride back to his ranch. He had been on the trail for 3 days, driving a small herd to market, and the weight of exhaustion sat heavy on his shoulders. He dismounted in front of the general store, tying his horse to the rail when something across the street caught his eye. A crowd had gathered near the bakery, not in celebration, but in the way crowds gather to witness someone's shame. He pushed through the throng of onlookers to find an Apache woman kneeling in the dirt. Her clothes were worn thin, her face gaunt with hunger, her dark eyes hollow from days without proper food. In her outstretched hands, she held nothing, just empty palms turned upward in the universal gesture of pleading. She was begging for bread. The baker stood in his doorway, arms crossed, his face a mask of contempt. "Move along," he spat. "We don't feed your kind here." The woman did not move. She simply lowered her head, her shoulders shaking with a silent, desperate shame that made Caleb's chest tighten with an anger he had not expected. He had seen cruelty before. He had witnessed men do terrible things to one another on the frontier. But there was something about this moment. This woman reduced to begging while the townsfolk watched with cold indifference that cut through him like a blade. She was not asking for gold or land. She was asking for bread, the most basic of human needs, denied not because there was none to give, but because of the blood in her veins and the color of her skin. Caleb felt the weight of 100 silent judgments pressing down on that dusty street, and in that moment, something inside him made a decision. He stepped forward, his boots loud on the wooden boardwalk, drawing the attention of the crowd. The baker looked at him with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "You got business here, stranger?" the man asked, his voice laced with warning. Caleb did not answer him. Instead, he walked past the baker, into the bakery, and emerged a moment later with a loaf of bread in his hand. The crowd fell silent. He walked directly to the Apache woman, who looked up at him with eyes that held no hope, only the weary expectation of another humiliation. Then, in a voice that carried across the entire street, he said, "Come with me right now." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The Apache woman stared at him, uncomprehending, as if no one had ever spoken such words to her before. Caleb knelt down, bringing himself to her level, and pressed the bread into her hands. Her fingers trembled as they closed around the loaf, and for a moment, she simply held it, as if afraid it might vanish. Then she looked at him again, and in her eyes, he saw something shift, a flicker of disbelief, of wonder, of a hope so fragile it might shatter at the wrong word. "Come with me," he repeated, softer this time. "You'll be safe." The crowd erupted. Shouts of outrage, accusations, warnings about what would happen if he brought her kind into their town. The baker shook his fist, his face red with fury. But Caleb paid them no mind. He helped the woman to her feet, his hand steady under her arm, and led her across the street to his horse. She moved slowly, her body weak from hunger, but she did not resist. When he lifted her onto the saddle, she clung to the bread with one hand and the horse's mane with the other, her knuckles white. Caleb untied the reins, mounted behind her, and without a backward glance, rode out of Santo Creek. They rode in silence for the first mile, the dust of the town settling behind them. Caleb felt the woman's tension in the stiffness of her back, the way she held herself as if expecting at any moment to be thrown from the horse. He did not speak. He simply let the rhythm of the horse's gait carry them forward, away from the judgment and the cruelty, toward the solitude of his ranch. The bread remained clutched in her hands, untouched, as if she was afraid that eating it would somehow break the spell of kindness she had been shown. When they crested the first ridge, he finally spoke. "What's your name?" For a long moment, she did not answer. Then, in a voice so soft it was almost swallowed by the wind, she said, "Nalin." Caleb nodded. "I'm Caleb." My ranch is a few hours north. There's food there, a place to rest." He paused, then added, "No one will hurt you there." Nalin did not respond, but he felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. She broke off a small piece of the bread and ate it slowly, as if savoring each crumb. They rode on, the desert stretching before them in waves of amber and gold. And for the first time in a very long while, Caleb felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The ranch was modest, a two-room cabin, a small barn, a corral that held 3 horses and a handful of cattle. It was not much, but it was his. Caleb helped Nalin down from the horse and led her to the cabin, pushing open the door to reveal a simple interior. A stone hearth, a wooden table, a bed in the corner covered with a wool blanket. He gestured to the chair by the fire. "Sit, I'll get something cooking." She hesitated, her eyes scanning the room with the wariness of someone who had learned to expect danger from every shadow. But the fire was warm, and the cabin smelled of wood smoke and leather, and slowly she lowered herself into the chair. Caleb moved about the kitchen with the efficiency of a man accustomed to fending for himself. He cut thick slices of salt pork, dropped them into a cast iron skillet, added beans from a clay pot, and set a kettle of coffee to heat over the flames. All the while, he did not look at her. He understood that she needed space, needed time to understand that this was not a trap. When the food was ready, he set a plate before her, more food than she had likely seen in days. She looked at it, then at him, and for the first time, her eyes glistened. "Why?" she whispered. Caleb sat across from her, his own plate untouched. He considered the question, knowing that any answer would sound inadequate. "Because you were hungry," he said finally. "Because no one should have to beg for bread in the dirt." He took a sip of coffee, then added, "Because I've been hungry too. And I remember what it felt like when someone finally fed me." Nalin looked at him for a long moment, searching for something in his face: deception, pity, some hidden motive. Whatever she was looking for, she did not find it. She picked up her spoon and began to eat, slowly at first, then with a hunger that spoke of too many empty days. They ate in silence, and when she was finished, Caleb showed her to the bed. "Take it," he said, when she hesitated. "I'll sleep by the fire." She started to protest, but he shook his head. "You need it more than I do." She looked at the bed, then at him, and something passed between them, an understanding that required no words. She lay down, pulling the blanket around her thin shoulders, and within minutes, her breathing slowed into the rhythm of exhausted sleep. Caleb sat by the fire, watching the flames, knowing that the town of Santo Creek would not let this pass quietly. But for now, there was peace. 3 days passed. Nalin grew stronger with each meal, her hollow cheeks filling out, her eyes losing the desperate edge that had marked her in the village. She spoke little, but when she did, her voice was soft, measured, each word chosen with care. She helped around the cabin without being asked, mending his shirts, tending the fire, learning the rhythm of his life. Caleb found himself watching her in the quiet moments, marveling at the quiet strength that seemed to live beneath her silence. He had brought her here to save her, but slowly, almost without realizing it, she was saving something in him too. On the 4th morning, trouble arrived. Caleb was mending a fence when he saw 3 riders approaching from the south. He recognized the lead man, Silas Tate, the wealthiest rancher in the territory, a man who wielded power like a weapon. Behind him rode the baker from Santo Creek, and a man Caleb did not recognize, a hard-faced man with a star pinned to his vest. They reined in before the cabin, and Silas dismounted with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. "Heard you been keeping company with Apache," Silas said, his voice oily with false friendliness. "That's a dangerous game, Hartley." Caleb set down his hammer and stood his ground. "She's a guest of my home. That's all." The baker stepped forward, his face still red with the same fury from the village. "She's a beggar, a thief. She don't belong here." The man with the star, the local sheriff. Caleb realized shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Silas smiled, a cold, thin smile. Now, Hartley, we're not unreasonable men. We're just looking out for the safety of our town. That woman leaves today, and we forget this ever happened. Or, he let the threat hang in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. Caleb's jaw tightened, but before he could answer, a voice spoke from the cabin doorway. No. Nalin stood in the doorway, her back straight, her chin lifted. She looked at Silas with eyes that held no fear. I go nowhere. Silas's smile vanished. This doesn't concern you, woman. Nalin stepped forward, and there was something in her movement that made even the sheriff take a step back. You came to my village, she said, her voice low and steady. You burned our homes. You killed my father. You left my mother to die in the snow. She pointed at the baker. You watched. And now you come here, to a man who showed me kindness, and you speak of safety? Her voice did not rise, but it cut through the morning air like a blade. You are the danger, not me. The silence that followed was deafening. Silas's face twisted with rage, his hand moving toward his pistol. But Caleb was faster. He stepped between them, his own hand resting on his revolver, his eyes locked on Silas. She's not leaving, Caleb said, his voice cold and final. And if you draw that gun, you won't be leaving either. The sheriff finally spoke, his voice weary. Silas, this ain't worth it. Silas glared at Caleb, then at Nalin, his hatred burning in his eyes. But he was a man who valued his life more than his pride. He lowered his hand, spat on the ground, and turned back to his horse. This isn't over, he said, mounting up. Not by a long shot. They rode out, and Caleb watched them until they disappeared over the ridge. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. He turned to Nalin, expecting to see fear in her face. Instead, he saw something else, a fierce, burning defiance that took his breath away. You didn't have to say that, he said quietly. You didn't have to face him. She looked at him, and for a moment, the wall she had built around herself seemed to crack. He would have come anyway, she said. He will come again. But I am tired of running. She paused, then added, I am tired of being afraid. Caleb looked at her. This woman who had been brought so low, who had found the strength to stand tall anyway, and something shifted inside him. That night, they sat by the fire, the silence between them different, now warmer, softer. Caleb told her about his past, about the wife he had lost to fever, about the years of loneliness that had followed. She listened without judgment, and when he was done, she reached out and placed her hand over his. Her skin was warm, her touch gentle, and for the first time in years, Caleb felt the cold emptiness inside him begin to thaw. You saved me, she said quietly. You gave me bread when the world gave me stones. She looked into his eyes. That is something I will never forget. The firelight danced between them, and in its glow, two lonely souls found something they had stopped looking for. Months passed. Silas and his men never returned. The sheriff had spoken to them privately, reminding them that driving a man off his land for helping a starving woman was not the kind of story that played well in a court of law. The town of Sano Creek eventually forgot its outrage, moving on to the next scandal, the next outrage. But Caleb and Nalin did not forget. They built a life together, not a life defined by the judgments of others, but a life built on trust, on kindness, on the simple act of a man offering bread to a woman who had nothing. And on quiet evenings, when the desert wind whispered through the canyon, they would sit together on the porch, and Nalin would lean her head against Caleb's shoulder, and they would remember the day when two words changed everything. Come with me,